Welcome to another deep dive. This time, it's all about unearthing these, well, kind of like trending tidbits. They're hidden in this whole stack of research about social epidemics. And get this, we're going to be talking bank robberies, healthcare choices, childhood vaccinations, the whole nine yards. And there's this fascinating link to Miami's, whole cultural scene that I bet you wouldn't expect at all.
It really is amazing how these seemingly small things, they can just spark these huge ripple effects. Like you'll be surprised by how individual actions, particularly within certain cultural contexts, can actually spark these social trends we're going to be talking about.
So, okay, let's start by rewinding the clock back to the 1980s in Los Angeles. It was like the bank robbery capital of the world back then. You'd think it was like some massive organized crime wave, right?
Yeah, that's a natural assumption, but the FBI actually uncovered something pretty unexpected. It wasn't a widespread phenomenon, you see. It was a handful of incredibly prolific individuals driving this surge in robberies.
That's wild. So it's almost like a disease outbreak, except instead of a virus, you've got like a behavior spreading like wildfire.
Exactly. It's called the super spreader concept. And the stories are incredible. There was this duo, Casper and Sea Dog, and they orchestrated something like 175 robberies. They were like cultural vectors, drawing in teenagers and essentially making bank robbery a trend among their recruits.
Wow, 175 robberies.
Mm.
Have you ever noticed how some people just have this like outsized influence on trends? Even like decisions. It's like that one friend who always knows the coolest new spots or the must-have gadget.
Yeah, and that's a great point. It highlights how individuals' impacts can be amplified in specific environments. Like, think about someone like Willie Sutton, the infamous bank robber. His notoriety may have inspired others to follow in his, footsteps.
Now, completely shifting gears here, have you ever stopped to think about like why medical practices are so different from place to place? Even within the same state, the rates of things like tonsillectomies or hysterectomies can be wildly different.
That's a phenomenon known as small area variation. And surprisingly, it's not really driven by patient demand. Instead, it seems to be all about physician preferences. They're often clustered in specific regions, too.
So it's not really what patients are asking for, but more like the medical culture in that particular area, huh?
Exactly. A great example of this is the radial insertion technique for cardiac catheters. It gained popularity in Buffalo, New York, because it's close to Canada, right? Well, Canada already had a different medical culture that favored this technique.
So even just that sort of cultural exchange can really impact something like medical practices. Our sources talk about this idea of an overstory, right? It's like the upper layer of foliage in a forest. It
Yeah.
affects everything that's growing beneath it. So in this context, it refers to those unseen cultural forces that shape our behaviors and beliefs. And guess what? Miami's overstory actually played a big role in a massive Medicare fraud scheme.
Ah, yes, the case of Philippus Formers. To understand this, we need to go back to the 1980s when Miami went through this huge transformation, like a massive wave of Cuban refugees, the cocaine boom, and social unrest just shattered all these existing norms and created this breeding ground for opportunity, but also, unfortunately, for exploitation, too.
It really does paint this picture of a city where like everything's changing so fast, almost an anything goes kind of atmosphere. The sources mention some pretty crazy things like storefronts posing as legitimate healthcare businesses. That's bold. Makes you wonder how much our surroundings actually affect our behavior, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. That turbulent period in Miami's history essentially created the perfect conditions for someone like Philippus Forms to, exploit the system. Florida's Medicare spending on durable medical equipment was significantly higher than the national average. Really highlights the extent of the fraud that was going on.
So let's talk about another example of this whole overstory thing at work. Waldorf schools and their vaccination rates. These schools, they consistently report low vaccination rates. It doesn't seem to matter where they're located or what the demographics of their student body are. Isn't that like a curious pattern?
It is. The Waldorf philosophy emphasizes a more holistic kind of learning, right?
Yeah.
And they tend to be a little skeptical of, well, conventional medicine. You see, many parents in this community believe in letting illnesses just run their course. They view vaccines as unnecessary interventions.
I've heard them talk about wanting their children to develop a superhero complex by overcoming illness naturally. Really highlights how shared beliefs within a community can sometimes totally override external pressures, even things like scientific consensus.
Exactly. It shows the power of group identity and social norms. People within a group often end up reinforcing each other's beliefs, even when those beliefs might clash with, like, mainstream views.
Our next stop on this deep dive takes us to Poplar Grove. It's like this seemingly picture-perfect, idyllic little town, but it has a dark secret. Underneath all that affluence is this epidemic of teenage mental health struggles and suicide attempts. It's heartbreaking, and honestly, it's pretty perplexing too.
I think what's really striking about Poplar Grove is its overstory, right? An overstory of achievement. You see, there's this immense pressure on students to, like, conform to a very narrow definition of success. Imagine a high school where everyone's striving for the same thing, the same limited ideal. It's got to be like a pressure cooker.
Almost like a monoculture in nature. Think about cheetahs. They have low genetic diversity, and they're incredibly vulnerable to disease because of it. Maybe it's similar in Poplar Grove, like this lack of diverse perspectives and support systems might be contributing to this fragility.
That's a good analogy. When everyone's striving for the same thing, there's just not much room for individuality or alternative paths, is there? That lack of diversity can make a community more susceptible to these kinds of challenges.
This kind of leads us to this fascinating idea. It's called the magic third. Basically, it's this threshold where minority representation starts to have a big impact on a group's dynamics and culture.
Think about corporate boards. When you have enough women on a board, studies have shown that they bring a lot more collaboration and critical thinking to the table.
And it's not just boardrooms. Going beyond that magic third can even close achievement gaps in classrooms. It's amazing how representation can have such a profound impact on individual performance. Have you ever noticed like a shift in dynamics within a group when a certain level of diversity is reached?
It's a compelling observation. It suggests that diversity isn't just about, fairness. It's also about creating a more robust and effective system. When you include different perspectives, the whole group really does benefit.
But what happens when people deliberately try to manipulate those group proportions? That's when we get into social engineering, right?
That's where things get a little, well, complex. Take college admissions, for example, especially at prestigious institutions like Harvard. They've got these elaborate systems designed to shape their student body, legacy preferences, athletic recruitment. They go to great lengths to, maintain specific demographics.
It feels like they're like playing chess with people's lives, carefully calculating each move. And the lengths they go to are sometimes pretty startling. Like, athletes often get a significant advantage in the admissions process, even over applicants who are academically, well, superior.
It definitely raises some important questions about things like fairness and meritocracy. Are these systems really serving the broader good, or are they just perpetuating existing power structures?
Let's use the Harvard rugby team as an example. Okay, if you actually look at the socioeconomic backgrounds of the players, it tells you a lot about how the institution is trying to curate a specific type of student body.
That's a great example of how these systems actually work in practice. It really does make you think about who benefits from these practices and whether they actually create a level playing field.
Now let's jump ahead to 2020 and the Biogen conference. It was a super spreader event that led to, get this, hundreds of thousands of COVID-19 infections. What made this particular gathering so impactful, do you think?
To understand that, I think we need to talk about aerosols. See, the virus spreads through these tiny airborne particles, right? And get this, talking is actually a much bigger factor than coughing or sneezing.
So it's not just about like staying away from people who are visibly sick, but really understanding all these invisible ways the virus can spread. Okay, let's say there's this hypothetical Mr. Index. He's our super spreader, maybe he was older, had a higher BMI, just things that made him more likely to spread the virus without even knowing it.
And those seemingly small characteristics can actually have a huge impact on transmission. If we trace Mr. Index's movements through the conference and after, it shows how individual behavior, mixed with those personal factors, can shape a pandemic's trajectory.
Like a domino effect, where every interaction could lead to a new chain of infection. Really underscores how important it is to understand those hidden factors when you're dealing with these big public health crises, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It really challenges some of our assumptions about individual responsibility and highlights just how interconnected our actions are, especially during something like a pandemic.
Okay, let's turn our attention to the opioid epidemic now. Believe it or not, this crisis can actually be traced back to this small pharmaceutical company in Connecticut. They were pushing hard to market their new painkiller, OxyContin.
The evolution of this crisis is both fascinating and tragic. It really shows how overstories and superspreaders can work together to create these devastating social epidemics.
So this company, Purdue Pharma, the makers of OxyContin, they really zeroed in on a specific group of doctors. They called them super core doctors.
Right.
These were the ones who wrote a disproportionate number of prescriptions. It's like they knew exactly who the most influential players were in the prescribing game.
And their marketing, it was incredibly effective. They really capitalized on the trust that exists between doctors and pharmaceutical companies. They downplayed the risks of addiction and really pushed the drug's benefits for patients who had chronic pain.
And that's where that overstory idea comes back in. See, in California, they had this triplicate prescription system for opioids. It was meant to control use and track how it was being distributed, but it ended up having a really unexpected ripple effect.
Exactly. It made prescribing opioids way more complicated in California. So what did Purdue Pharma do? They just shifted their marketing focus to states that didn't have those restrictions. So this policy in California, even though it was well-intentioned, it actually helped fuel the crisis somewhere else. It's a classic example of unintended consequences.
It's almost like you squeeze one end of a balloon and all the pressure just shifts to the other side.
That's a perfect analogy. Really highlights how interconnected these social epidemics can be. What you do in one place can have these huge consequences somewhere else. And they're not always the consequences you expect. You know what? I think this might be a good place to pause for now.
Yeah, good idea. We've covered a lot already. We'll pick up this thread and dive even deeper into the opioid crisis in the next part.
It just goes to show you, even when you have the best intentions, things can go wrong in ways you'd never expect.
So we were talking about how overstories, super spreaders, even group proportions, all these things are tied up in the opioid epidemic. It's crazy.
Yeah, and it really makes you think about how we deal with these complicated problems, right? We often focus on individual responsibility, but these sources are saying, hold on a second, it's way more complex than that.
It's kind of like blaming a single tree for starting a whole forest fire. When the conditions were already there just waiting for a spark, sure, individual actions are important, but they can either be amplified or totally suppressed, depending on the whole social and cultural environment.
Think back to those bank robbery super spreaders, Casper and Sea Dog, right? They were able to exploit a specific context. They were influencing vulnerable teenagers who were already in a culture that kind of glamorized crime.
It makes you think, how much of what we do is actually shaped by stuff we're not even aware of? What are the overstories that are operating in our lives right now, shaping our choices, our perceptions, the whole thing?
It's a good question to sit with for a while, right? It makes you want to be more, I don't know, more aware of all the subtle things that influence the world around us and to really examine our own assumptions. Think about those healthcare variations we were talking about before, right? Maybe the way you make medical decisions is actually being influenced by the medical culture where you live, even if you don't realize it.
It's like we're swimming in this ocean of cultural currents, and we don't even know which way they're pushing us. Then there's that whole social engineering thing, where people are actually trying to, manipulate those group proportions on purpose to get a specific outcome.
It's powerful stuff, and it's happening all over the place. College admissions policies, marketing strategies, even urban planning. People are trying to control group dynamics. Sometimes it's for the better, but sometimes not so much.
Makes you wonder about the ethics of it all, right? When is it okay to try and influence those social forces? And who gets to decide that? For example, is it ethical for a company to use really sophisticated marketing to target vulnerable people, the way Purdue Pharma did with those super core doctors?
Those are the million-dollar questions. No easy answers there. But it's so important that we talk about this stuff and that we're aware of what might happen because of what we do, both individually and as a society. Have you ever noticed this in your own workplace, by the way? Attempts to manipulate group dynamics or influence decisions through these social engineering tactics?
It's crazy how all this stuff we're talking about, these concepts, actually play out in our everyday lives, and we don't even know it half the time. But recognizing these hidden forces can help us be more, conscious participants in how our world takes shape.
Totally. We can advocate for policies that are fair and equitable. We can hold corporations accountable for what they do, and we can make choices that contribute to a more just and, well, sustainable society.
It's like we're all these little pieces in a giant puzzle,
Right.
all connected in ways we don't even fully understand. But when we start to understand those connections, those trends, it's like we can finally see the bigger picture.
Speaking of seeing the bigger picture, remember that Biogen conference? It wasn't just some random event that turned into a super spreader, right? It was this, like, perfect storm of factors. From the science of aerosols to those individual characteristics, it all contributed.
It really shows you that even with all our scientific advancements, we're still vulnerable to these invisible forces.
Mhm.
We could try to be careful, but we can't control everything, can we? Like the spread of a virus or the ripple effects of our own actions.
It's a good reminder to stay humble and adaptable, right? We have to be ready to change our behavior when new information comes along and, well, admit that we don't know everything.
Mm.
Remember those unseen cultural forces, the overstories? Sometimes it's like we need to be detectives, uncovering those subtle influences that shape our choices and how we see the world.
And other times, we got to be gardeners, tending to the social ecosystems we live in, cultivating diversity and making them resilient. So we're ready when the next storm hits.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it brings us back to the opioid crisis, a storm that has, well, devastated communities everywhere.
We've been talking about how this one company, this small pharmaceutical company, and their marketing tactics, how that fueled this epidemic, along with this really complex mix of social and cultural factors. But there's one more piece of this puzzle we got to look at. The role of this law enforcement official in California. He actually had a hand in shaping how the crisis unfolded, but not on purpose.
It's a story that really highlights how our actions can have consequences we never intended, that spread outward like ripples in a pond.
So are you ready to dive into the next chapter? Let's go. Let's uncover the hidden connections that help fuel the spread of the opioid crisis. Okay, so we're back and ready to really get into this next layer of the opioid crisis. It's all about the very beginning, how this seemingly harmless painkiller, OxyContin, started it all.
It might surprise you to learn that the company behind OxyContin, Purdue Pharma, wasn't just some fly-by-night operation. They were a well-established pharmaceutical company, had a good reputation for developing, innovative medications, and they were determined to make OxyContin a huge success.
But here's the thing. OxyContin had oxycodone in it. That's a seriously addictive opioid. You'd think someone would have raised a red flag about that, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where their marketing strategy comes in. They didn't try to reach everyone. They focused laser-like on specific doctors, the ones who wrote the most prescriptions. They knew if they could influence those key players, it would have a huge ripple effect on the whole medical community.
So it was like they created a super spreader effect, but within the medical profession itself, huh?
Exactly. They pinpointed those super core doctors, the ones who were already writing tons of opioid prescriptions. Then they went all out, give them tons of attention, incentives, you name it. And they spun this narrative about OxyContin.
It's incredible how they were able to shape the whole conversation around the drug. The sources say they downplayed the addiction risks and really played up the benefits for patients who were dealing with chronic pain. Was there any evidence to back up those claims?
Well, that's the thing. They made some pretty bold claims. They said less than 1% of patients would get addicted to OxyContin, which of course turned out to be totally false. But it was a powerful message, especially for doctors who were, just trying to help their patients.
It just goes to show, even in professions where trust and expertise are, like everything, manipulation can still happen. Speaking of which, remember those unseen cultural forces, the overstories we were talking about? Well, California had this system called triplicate prescriptions for opioids. What was the deal with that?
The idea was to control opioid use and keep track of where it was going. Basically, every single prescription had to be written on a special form, 3 copies, one for the doctor, one for the pharmacist, and one for the state's Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement.
Sounds like a pretty tight system. Did it actually work?
It definitely made prescribing opioids in California way more of a hassle, and this is where we see those unintended consequences popping up again. Purdue Pharma, they just took their marketing show on the road, so to speak, focused on states that didn't have all those restrictions.
So they just moved the problem around instead of actually fixing anything, huh? It's like plugging one hole in a leaky boat. The water's just going to find another way in.
Perfect analogy. It shows how tough it is to deal with these big social problems. Sometimes trying to fix things in one place just creates a mess somewhere else.
Let's talk about those super core, doctors for a minute, the ones Purdue Pharma was targeting. Did they even know about the risks of OxyContin?
I think it's important to remember that a lot of these doctors, they had good intentions. They wanted to help their patients who were in pain, and they trusted what Purdue Pharma was saying about how safe and effective OxyContin was.
It's a reminder that we can all be swayed by a good sales pitch, especially if it's coming from someone we see as an authority figure. But in this case, those claims, they were just plain misleading. Purdue Pharma downplayed the dangers and promoted the drug for way more conditions than it was approved for.
Exactly. And that created this perfect storm for the opioid crisis to explode. You had this super addictive drug, and it was being prescribed in massive amounts by doctors who didn't understand the real risks.
And then, as more and more people got hooked, the demand for OxyContin just went through the roof,
Ugh.
which created this whole black market that made the problem even worse. It's just heartbreaking how a company's greed could cause so much suffering.
The opioid crisis is a huge wake-up call. We got to be on guard, holding corporations responsible for what they do and protecting people from products that can hurt them.
So where does that leave us? We've uncovered some pretty crazy trends today. Think of it as trending tidbits, but with some serious consequences. We've seen how even the smallest things, like one person's decision or a policy that seemed like a good idea at the time, can trigger this massive chain reaction that ends up affecting millions of lives.
We've talked about those overstories, those cultural forces we don't even see that shape how we act and what we believe.
And we dove into the world of superspreaders, people who can spread trends and behaviors, sometimes without even meaning to. And sometimes the results are devastating.
It's clear that the things we do as individuals matter, but they're also tied to the social and cultural environments we're all a part of.
It's a call to action, really, to pay attention to the forces shaping our world and to think about how the choices we make might have ripple effects we don't even see.
The more we understand these trending tidbits, the more we can be conscious participants in shaping the trends that affect our lives and the lives of everyone around us.
And that's a wrap for our deep dive today. Thanks for listening.